about policing and the perpetuation of racial bias. So if you tuned into the very first panel of the day, then you heard Professor Cousteau on the first panel explaining that the Supreme Court has held that charges against the constitutionality of police officers using deadly force will be judged from a Fourth Amendment analysis, which guarantees us all the freedom, all the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. So if a person is killed by the police, the courts treat it as a seizure. And then the understanding that this is a seizure where we just look to the reasonableness of police action is really what's incorporated into the laws, the state laws allowing police officers to use deadly force. It's the way, it's what informs the instructions that we give jurors about the use of force, including grand jurors in their decisions to bring charges. And so they're supposed to be considering whether police officers acted reasonably in reasonable fear for their lives when they kill an individual. And so we've heard this type of discussion all day, dealing with the killing of Miss Taylor, where no charges were brought. And the officers, the conversation goes, well, these officers were fired upon. So, of course, they were reasonable in firing back, and they were in reasonable fear for their lives. And so therefore they were justified. And that's, that's the way the conversation has been taking place. And that's how these conversations go. But when prosecutors and grand jurors, trial jurors, and the like are considering reasonableness, we have to understand how race plays a factor in that determination. And so when we ask, were the officers reasonable in their fear, what necessarily enters into that determination is really asking the fact finder, do you agree that the people whom the police were facing in that instance were threatening, right? And bias against Black people and beliefs about Black criminality have everything to do with the answers to that question. And so nowadays, scholars used to like to use the term implicit bias to talk about this. And I have my issues with always falling back on that as an explanation, but I do think it's helpful in understanding. I think it's helpful to understand the psychology. So I'll just explain it quickly. But if you've ever taken an implicit bias test, what you end up doing is you're matching up reaction terms like with different facial features. So terms that have positive connotations, joy, love, peace, wonderful, but also words with negative connotations like agony, terrible, horrible, nasty, those sorts of things with different facial features and skin tones. And the test is measuring your reaction time. And so what the test is proving is the existence of implicit bias, with the thinking being that implicit bias describes the cognitive process whereby, despite even the best intentions, people just automatically classify information in racially biased ways. And these studies have found that the majority of Americans tested carry implicit negative attitudes toward Blacks and associate Blacks with negative stereotypes. And so what this means, and why I think it's important to this discussion, is that studies have demonstrated that stereotypes linking Blacks with aggression cause people to judge Blacks' ambiguous behavior as more aggressive than identical behavior by whites. So when you ask a fact finder whether they think that officers were reasonable when they decided to use force in any given situation, what we're really asking those individuals, the majority of whom are more likely to interpret non-threatening behavior by Blacks as actually threatening, what we're asking them is, would they have been afraid and would have thought that deadly force was needed? So to me, this is a huge flaw in how we talk about the police use of force. I've written and given talks about this, calling it the death penalty on the streets when police officers kill people, because I believe that when we analyze police use of force as a type of punishment, instead of thinking about this sort of seizure language, then we can start to talk about it and analyze it differently. We can think about some of the Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment safeguards that we have against punishment, like the requirement for proportionality, that if we did that, that would necessarily prohibit the use of deadly force against anybody who's unarmed. And rather than looking at whether officers were deathly afraid of someone, which allows for really racist reactions to flourish, we would instead look at the entirety of the encounter and determine whether there were punishment procedures in place to avoid the use of deadly force, like first relying on non-lethal force, or even backing up the review scenario to not just the moment at which force became an option, but actually looking at the beginning of the story. This was also mentioned in the first panel, like the decision to enter someone's home under the warrant authority at midnight or 1 a.m. when there's a higher likelihood that the person inside would fear for their lives and react by protecting their home using force. You know, the Eighth Amendment requires that punishment be carried out in a manner consistent with human dignity, that it not be applied arbitrarily. And even though, you know, none of this is actually perfect and without racial bias in the court systems, the problem that I have is that any mention of these types of safeguards is missing when we're talking about police imposing the death penalty on the streets outside of the court system. And by not seeing police force as punishment and just asking about reasonable fear, we allow police to act on the same racial biases held by most Americans. And the numbers really do bear this out. So if you look at the numbers on the statistics on police killing people, you see that police kill a disproportionate number of Black people. So in the US population, African Americans only make up 13%, but they're 31% of all people killed by the police, and they're 39% of those killed by the police while not attacking. And so even though the numbers aren't good for anybody, right, 46% of whites, 12% of Hispanics, they're just completely disproportionate when it comes to African Americans. And so when police describe the use of force or their fear and in their decision to use force against Black people, they often describe their fear in racialized terms. So I'll give you an example. So for instance, the police officer who killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, we were just talking about that in the last panel in 2014, he gave testimony which depicted Michael as an enraged monster. There's really no other way to describe it. I'll give you his words. So like this enraged monster, untamable by any amount of negotiation. So at one point in his grand jury testimony, Officer Wilson said that he felt like a, quote, 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan. And he also described Michael as looking like a, quote, demon. Right? So this is how he described what I would say was a gentle-faced young man, right, who witnesses saw standing with his hands up when he was shot and killed. And the grand jury that declined charging that officer were asked to focus on the officer's reasonable fear, rather than on whether the officer followed non-fatal encounter procedures before resorting to deadly force. And this is, of course, because the law doesn't require such an inquiry, right? They were asked the question that the law asks, and they were able to inform that decision based on what we already know are racial biases against African Americans. So I'll end my remarks by bringing up just one more point about race and inflicting punishment outside of the court system. And that is to point out that it's not just the police who are acting out on this biased fear of Black people. So I recently gave a TEDx talk, in which I described what's been happening to Black people really forever in this country as being presumed punishable. And so that we're presumed punishable when we're sentenced on the streets, which is the way that I see it. So the police do it and everyday individuals do it. And what I mean by that is that contrary to the presumption of innocence, that is at least theoretically our constitutional protection in the courts, when Black people are seen out on the streets, they're just often presumed to be worthy of punishment, even if they're just doing everyday things. And so I'll just give you an example. Here's a list of some of the everyday things that African Americans were doing, just out living their lives, when someone, typically a white person, often a white woman, but typically a white person, calls the police on them, right? And so they do this because they see the Black person as deserving of punishment. And they are counting on the police to do the same thing, right? And to actually, to see Black people the same way and to inflict punishment. And studies show this as well. So when we look at thoughts or understandings about criminality, whites overestimate the percentage of burglaries, illegal drug sales, juvenile crimes committed by African Americans by as much as 30%. And this, by the way, this isn't an implicit bias study where you're testing quick reaction times. This is people who are sitting down, pondering, thinking about the information that they've sort of collected in life, and they come out in this way. Across all races, because this is a bias that's held really across the board, across all races, people overestimate Black participation in violent crime by over 10%.